Well, this is my third time making this video, and safe to say I tried too hard to make it sound like I'm not reading from a script. But it's whatever. Anyway, knowing myself as a vintage computer enjoyer, I sadly don't own a 486 computer. In fact, getting such hardware isn't cheap anymore. But the oldest machine I still have laying around is a Dell Dimension P75t, which in the name has an Intel Pentium 75MHz processor. However, according to some forums, the earlier Pentiums, particularly at 60 MHz, are somewhat comparable to a high-class 486 processor, clocked at 100 MHz. I guess the only difference compared to the 486 is the addition of an actual floating point unit with more instructions, which certain games like Quake make good use of. This could explain why it doesn't play very well on a 486 class processor. Maybe the only way to get it to play somewhat decently is to use one of the fastest 486 processors available, and in addition with a 3D accelerator card, like a 3DFX Voodoo, assuming your motherboard has PCI slots. But sometimes you will come across certain socket 3 motherboards that had that dreaded barrel battery or Dallas clock battery ready to kill the motherboard. Nonetheless, the Pentium 75MHz machine has a coin battery, which started to come around during the late days of the 486 era machines. I originally got these old machines instead of building them myself because I didn't have the confidence to build my own until years later. I know I certainly did when I built my new main rig with an Intel Core i9-10850K processor. But one thing I've learned about collecting vintage computers, let alone computer parts, is that you have to be very patient in order to get the good deals without selling your kidneys for a $500 486 machine on eBay. This could vary very greatly depending on where you live. In my case, I would have to be very lucky to find a Pentium 4 machine. Nonetheless, I originally thought, what if I just underclocked the 75MHz machine to 60 MHz? Maybe I could simulate how a 486 100MHz machine feels. I believe it is possible because the motherboard, an Intel Advanced EV from 1995, has dip switches that allow me to overclock or downclock the processor by selecting specific switches. However, because of some research, the lowest I can go is 75 MHz. So sadly, this is the closest to a 486 DX4 equivalent that I could have at the moment. Either way, this is how I originally overclocked it to 90 MHz, the majority of the time I've used this machine. In the past few years, I've often referred to this machine as a 90 MHz Pentium because of the overclock, but in reality, it's not really an actual Pentium 90 CPU. It's interesting because these Pentiums can potentially be turned into some time machine rig unlike the Pentium 2 processor. For an example of such rig, I suggest looking at Phil's Computer Lab's video on the subject. However, if my memory serves me correctly, this was pretty much accomplished using an MS-DOS program called setmul, which allows you to change the clock frequency without having to open up the computer and set jumpers, which is understandable for those looking for convenience. However, I rarely experiment with these programs unless absolutely necessary because they can be tricky to use. In the case of my Pentium 3 machine, it makes sense, but now that I can underclock a Pentium 2 with the right motherboard, I just go with that route instead. But only with certain Pentium 2 processors that use the Klamath architecture. I went as low as 133 MHz with the 300 MHz Pentium 2 processor. But anyways, back to the Pentium 75MHz machine. For the operating system, I usually run Windows 95. I would use something older like Windows 3.11 for this one because it allows for a little bit of more headroom for such a low-end Pentium CPU, but I would lose some compatibility with certain games. Plus, gaming on Windows 3.11 can be mediocre at best, but there are some hidden gems out there. Just gotta go keep digging for some. Probably on some shareware CDs. For this video, I wanted to see what it would have been like to use this machine for different activities and games. Because let's be honest, I don't think it would be practical for everyday use, but rather more of a fun hobby, as always. I wouldn't really call this a challenge, like, can I use this vintage computer for a week? Because it's obvious that I would cheat anyway, usually for certain tasks. The majority of the files I needed are stored inside of a Samba network share powered by a Linux distro named Debian. It currently has a 1TB hard drive that holds the majority of the data, which I also use for a Plex server, but this is because my family cut the cable as it was becoming more expensive. However, if I have the money and patience for a good deal, I intended to upgrade to a 12TB hard drive, but that's something for another time. I would imagine watching videos on such an old processor would not be as good by today's standards, considering most of the time even a Core 2 Duo or Core 2 Quad with Windows XP could watch YouTube to some extent. However, because I have a file server, I can simply download videos off the internet and watch them offline, once they have been converted to a compatible video format. Which is nice because as a vintage computing enjoyer, there are numerous advantages with having a file server because it makes transferring files practically easier, given that you have your machines wired up using an Ethernet switch. Anyway, watching MPEG videos appears to be rather stuttery for whatever reason. It probably has something to do with how FFmpeg converts these original videos, so I ended up converting them to Cinepack using Virtual Dub instead, which seems to convert Cinepack footages a little bit more faster than using FFmpeg, based on my experience. But it's safe to say that if you have the right tools and know where to look, you can simply enjoy offline video playback on your old Pentium machine. The next activity I don't show very often, which I wanted to try it out anyway, which is basically showing off some demo scene programs. It's honestly amazing to see how far programmers have come in pushing the now older technology. I mean, sure, the popular Second Reality demo from 1993 on this Pentium obviously performs very well, but it makes you wonder how low I would go in performance. Could I just run this on a 386SX machine? I wish I could test that idea, but I don't have such hardware from the era. But who knows, maybe someday. Getting this demo to run on this machine was a little bit tricky due to memory management, but with some tweaking, I can now boot into the MS-DOS prompt or into Windows 95 on startup. Perhaps I could consider making a tutorial video about this boot menu someday. Next is the character demonstration for Into the Shadows, which appears to be running decently. It was probably the most impressive thing I have seen because of its smoother animations at its time. And this demo came out 9 months before the release of Quake, which the latter had rather choppy animations when compared to this demo. It was supposed to be a game by Triton, which was to be published by Scavenger, but it didn't come out due to the publisher going bankrupt. But imagine if this actually did come out. I would imagine it would be a good game for certain hardware at the time. Loading images from a network drive onto this machine, especially with really high resolutions like those taken with a phone camera, appears to take quite a while, actually. The image viewer of choice for this one is AC/DC, and I had originally planned to use some of these photos to show how Photoshop handles them on this machine. Instead, I ended up creating some shitty artwork. The painting was apparently so bad that when I showed it to my friends, they questioned what they were looking at. I originally imagined the drawing as some landscape being thunderstruck, but looking at it, it appears to be rather blurry, all entirely done using an airbrush. But I must say that the smudge tool sure brings the computer to its knees. Which is funny because I thought Photoshop was locked until I switched Windows and saw changes being slowly made. That aside, I can say that Photoshop is serviceable, but I would imagine needing a beefier computer for those high-resolution images. Or maybe just downsizing them to handle the 75 MHz machine a bit better. On the gaming side, I discovered that running certain DOS games in MS-DOS mode rather than inside Windows improves performance in some cases. In the case of Descent 2 Interactive Demo, I find it to be somewhat enjoyable. Descent tends to be one of those games that is best played on lower-end hardware, because the mouse movement is tied to the frame rate. So moving the mouse feels really slow and uncomfortable if you're playing this on a faster processor. Not to mention that on top of mouse issues, running this game on a faster processor, especially at 320 by 200 resolution, causes the game to run too quickly. this can render the game practically unplayable unless you could tolerate it to some extent. Now, one of the only ways to enjoy the game on such a faster processor would have been to play it at 640 by 480 resolution. At least that's how I played Descent on a Pentium 3 laptop, clocked at 450 MHz, but that was in 2013. You could also use a slowdown utility to work around this issue as well. But I will say that Windows gaming, on the other hand, can vary in performance depending on the game itself. Here is Necrodome by Raven Software, released in 1996. Here I am playing the shareware demo, which features exclusive levels. The performance of this game is rather adequate. However, I was playing this on my Dell LCD monitor, which did not properly scale the screen correctly. Probably because this game was running at an unusual resolution of 320 by 400. Next up is an early build of Age of Empires, but this was played back when it was overclocked to 90 MHz. Oddly, the game appears to be lagging frequently when certain sound effects are playing, which I assume it has something to do with the sound code powered with direct sound. However, when I turned off the sound effects, it seemed to help a little bit. Now, speaking of sound, I wonder what MP3 playback was like on this machine. On some mid-range 486 machine, I would imagine it would have struggled without reducing quality, but it seems to handle 320 kilobits per second MP3s pretty well, or reasonably well, though the only time it appeared to chug was when I was copying files. I thought it was my network share at first that was causing the problems on this machine, but when I copied the MP3s onto a hard drive and played it before copying files again, it seems to have reduced it a little bit. It didn't go away entirely. Personally, I haven't browsed the internet on this machine while playing music in the background in a while, so I went ahead and did it for this video. It is quite obvious that many websites do not work on this machine, but there are some compatible websites such as my own and the DOSBox Deathmatch Club website you could check out. But there is ProtoWeb if you wish to enjoy more web browsing. In conclusion, it's safe to say that I still enjoy this machine, even without the 3D acceleration stuff that I currently don't have access to. As a DOS gaming machine, it is rather adequate for most games prior to 1996. Though you could still enjoy some certain amount of Windows games, but that can vary depending on the game itself. When there are some speed-sensitive games that do not work well on these faster PCs, like my Pentium 2 machine, I always go back to this machine to play these games, unless I decided to fire up some slowdown utility if I didn't feel like swapping machines. But anyways, that about wraps up this video. If you like what you saw, please drop a like and a comment. It really means a lot. And as always, peace out.